Hey, everybody. I think we're going to get started. Thank you all for coming. It's so overwhelming to see all your faces here. Very grateful that you came out tonight. We definitely want to start off by thanking Verso for letting us use this beautiful space. Jake and Rachel in particular were instrumental in that, so we're very grateful. We also had a lot of volunteers from New York City DSA Tech Action, who you'll hear from a little later. And we couldn't have done it without them too, so give them a round of applause. So I'm Ben. I'm one of the founding editors of Logic, and I thought I would start just by very briefly describing what Logic is. Logic is a magazine about technology. We come out 3 times a year. Each issue is on a different theme, and our latest issue is on the theme of justice. It's our biggest issue yet. We have topics from municipal broadband to algorithmic racism to why Silicon Valley hates journalists. So if any of those subjects appeal to you, we have issues for sale right over here, and we're selling subscriptions as well. Before I introduce the panel, I'm going to hand it off to Will, who's a member of New York City DSA Tech Action, who's co-hosting this event with us tonight. Here's Will.
Thanks, Ben. Hello, everyone. On behalf of the Tech Action Working Group, I'd also like to start by thanking Logic Magazine, Verso Books, and our esteemed panel for making this event happen. My name is Will Luckman, and I'm one of the co-organizers of the Tech Action Working Group for the NYC DSA. The Democratic Socialists of America is a democratically organized, national-scale, member-driven socialist organization with chapters across the country. In NYC alone, we have over 3,000 members spread throughout all 5 boroughs. Tech Action wanted to co-host this event tonight because up until very recently, the tech industry has done a very good job of skirting political scrutiny. On the left, we embrace the power of technology to unite us and improve our world, but we find the way it is currently being used very troubling. It is technology wielded by capitalists that is the problem. Technology driven by the profit motive. This manifests in a number of ways. In the media, we've seen a consolidation of content and revenue flowing through global gatekeepers. We've seen a rise in the gig economy, aided by apps and platforms which jettison a living wage and benefits for workers in the service of expediency. For the most vulnerable to law enforcement, we've seen a rise in computer-aided predictive policing, sentencing, and bail. We've seen tech workers across the spectrum, from the warehouse to the open office plan, exploited by overwork and unfair contracts, and their creativity and skills turned toward the creation of tools for surveillance, finance, and the military. And for any of us with smartphones or who regularly use the commercial internet, our information is being relentlessly harvested and mined to advertise to us with a level of precision and influence never before seen. These are just a handful of examples. In short, this affects everyone. The good news for us on the left is that in socialism, we have a toolkit for identifying and understanding these issues, strategies for fighting back, and a map forward. Our job now is twofold. The first step is to diagnose the problems and develop alternatives, which is why we are so thrilled about the discussion we are about to hear tonight. And the second is to put in real work to help to make these ideas for an alternative come to fruition. Thanks to everyone for joining us tonight. And if you'd like to get to work alongside us, we've got a sign-up list at the door. You don't have to be a member of the DSA to join in the conversation, and we encourage you to do so. And for those viewing at home, please find us on Twitter. Now I'll turn it back over to Ben to get things underway. Thanks.
Thanks, Will. Can everybody hear me? How are the levels? No? Not even a little bit? How about now? Now? Okay. So tonight we're talking about the internet we want. As we know, big tech is broken. Suddenly a wide range of journalists and politicians agree that something has gone horribly wrong with the internet. And as this realization sinks in and as the need for digital governance becomes clearer, how can the left seize the opportunity to advance a radical vision of digital democracy? So that's the question we're going to hopefully begin to answer tonight. And with us to help answer that question, we have Cathy O'Neill, mathematician, data scientist, author of the book Weapons of Math Destruction. Evan Malmgren, a writer and the author of a wonderful article in Logic's new issue about municipal broadband in Chattanooga, Tennessee. Next we have, I can't see who's next, Moira Weigel, who's a postdoctoral fellow at Harvard, a co-founder of Logic, and the author of another wonderful recent Guardian long read about tech worker organizing. And after Moira, we have Trebor Scholz, associate professor for culture and media at the New School, and the author most recently of Uber Worked and Underpaid. And finally, Astra Taylor, filmmaker, writer, author of The People's Platform. So thanks everyone for coming. I've really been looking forward to this for a while. I have a very difficult, unanswerable question to start us off. It'll be kind of a lightning round. I'm going to have everyone respond. And it's the kind of first question that came to me as I sat down to think about this, which is that the internet is really big. It's so big it's hard to think of as a whole. You know, you've got the pipes, kind of physical infrastructure of the network. You've got the platforms that own the data that flows through those pipes. You've got algorithms that help organize that data. So when we talk about building the internet we want, where do we start? You know, the left always has to make difficult decisions about how to allocate its usually limited resources. If we want to capitalize on this new mood of techno-skepticism that we're seeing and start to build a kind of movement for digital democracy, what's the battle that we want to pick first? So I might start with Cathy and work my way down.
Thanks for having me. Interesting question, which I won't be able to answer. So I think about algorithms a lot, and algorithms feed on data, and so I want algorithms to be held accountable. So we could talk about what that means, but in particular, it means that algorithms that are important enough to rise to the level of secret laws should be held accountable by people who are subject to them. So that's a kind of a transparency, that's kind of a appealability, et cetera. But I also, at the same time, to answer your question, I feel like there should be absolute limits on the kinds of algorithms that actually can be used, and the amount of, and the incentives would, if there were laws about that kind of thing. Just let me just throw something out because I'm a very concrete thinker. Like if we made it illegal to have tailored political ads on Facebook, because I think tailored political ads are a threat to democracy. If that were just illegal, then it would actually, there'd be way fewer incentives to surveil and collect data in the first place. So the value of that as a market would collapse. This is a theoretical framework, obviously. Right now, it's many, many billions of dollars of an industry. But the idea is like, if you dry up the demand, then the supply would actually get dried up too. And so that's the way I think about things.
Right. So whatever the extent to which corporations and other antisocial interests exert power over how we're able to engage with the internet, the question of basic access is still very important. You know, internet access in the 21st century is much more important than television or radio even in the 20th, right? It's not just Twitter and YouTube. We're talking about being able to manage a bank account, access social security benefits, you know, sign up for healthcare. These kind of basic self-sustaining tasks that increasingly everyone needs to participate in, or else they're going to get left behind. So if you need to go to the library to use the internet, you're not just settling for a crappy old computer that you can only use for half an hour. You're taking hours out of your day for something that's going to take other people 5 minutes. So this is how unequal internet access doesn't just reflect, but reinforces pre-existing material inequalities. And the reason for this is that we have a for-profit model for distributing internet access in this country, right? The four largest ISPs control about 75% of the national market, and almost half of the country, there's no competition for broadband. Even in New York City, right? People here know Fios, Verizon's fiber optic network that's billed as this super high-tech, modern, fast internet connection. It's supposed to connect to every home in the city, but didn't quite pan out, right? Through Fios, you can get a 100 megabit per second connection for $65 a month on a 2-year contract. In Romania, you can get a connection 10 times that speed. Okay, so you download a 2-hour movie in 30 seconds instead of 5 minutes for less than a third of the cost. And this is an issue that particularly impacts rural Americans and in urban areas, working class communities, and as a result, disproportionately, people of color lack access to good broadband infrastructure. So one of the most popular broadband providers in the country, though, is publicly owned. The EPB in Chattanooga, which is what my Logic article is about, is a public electric utility that manages a broadband network that services every home and business in the service area. And it's been very successful and has, you know, some of the fastest speeds in the world at what we would consider to be ridiculously low prices. Okay, so if you're on the National School Lunch Program, you can get a 100 megabit connection for $27 a month. And this has changed the way the city is able to think about internet access as a basic right rather than as a luxury good, right? It's not television. And so this trickles out into other initiatives for digital equity, such as tech literacy, subsidized hardware, and just generally making the internet more equally accessible. Because it can only ultimately be as equalizing as it is universally accessible to people, and we're not doing a very good job of that in this country right now.
Moira?
Oh, I'm short. The question is where to start.
What battle do we pick first?
All right.
There's so many.
Well, I think one interesting place to start is start thinking about the internet we would want, or better forms of digital governance, comes from workers, thinking about tech workers, and I construe that term pretty broadly. I think that especially in particular in the past few months, but really since the election, this kind of cleavage has opened up in terms of the orientations, attitudes, priorities of the leaders of the tech industry. So folks like Peter Thiel, Sheryl Sandberg, the other folks who went to meet with Trump, I guess about exactly a year ago now, and the folks who work at the companies that these people lead. I think that the difference between the desires of most of the people who build and work on technologies and the folks who own them, the sort of VC and CEO class, has become more and more evident. And I think there's a real political opportunity in that break, in that increasingly visible difference. And I hope we'll talk about this. I think when we think of the tech worker, we shouldn't only think of, you know, the Facebook or Google engineer. We also have to think of the folks who work in the cafeterias, the folks who work as janitors at those firms, in, you know, maybe it resonates more here, the like media content producers who put stuff that fills these platforms onto them. So I think we should construe that category of the tech worker or of the worker on the internet very broadly, but that basically the division between capital and labor in the tech industry has become clear because of our political situation, and that is a difference to be amplified, described, acknowledged, and then used in political organizing.
Okay, so just briefly, just trying to sort of sum this up. Thinking from, so the question was about responses. First of all, I think that, of course, I think the question itself, like to think of the internet as this isolated thing is somewhat problematic, right? So, of course, there's always a social organization that is far outside the tech, which is equally important. And then we think about, regulation as a response, right? Policy. Then we think of the recognition of workers. So in 2016, you had 12 million people making some money in the extractive sharing economy. So there's a shift, right, of labor markets to the internet. And the question is really like, how can you have a short-term, concrete alternative that people can actually be a part of? And as a response, I've, over the last few years, been working on bringing the cooperative business model and organizational model to the internet. So what it would be like if Uber drivers would be owning these platforms? What would it be like if cities would own platforms like Airbnb? And these ideas are very concrete. There's an ecosystem of some 200 businesses now pursuing this. And we are basically building, what we try to offer essentially is a project of transition, right? So definitely not a project that will end all of capitalism and bring it immediately to its knees, but something that you can work on next week, right? That you can engage with, that is quite concrete, and a project that can change the lives of a tangible group of people.
All right. So I guess I want to begin by saying that if I knew when I was working on my book, and I think I started working on it in 2009 or 2010, that I would be on a panel where there was some rousing socialist speechifying about the internet right before, I would have been so happy, because my book was written in utter bitchiness at the people who dominated the internet conversation at the time, who were these basically like technology free market cheerleaders, right? Who are just like, rah, rah, rah. You know, the internet's changing everything. It's a revolution, and we're going to make tons of money off of it. And there was no sort of, you know, the sort of mainstream conversation had no critical class consciousness at all. This is heartening. This is progress, and it's quite an interesting moment, because if anything, we've sort of, I think, the conversation has shifted into this dystopianism about the net, right? So, you know, there's this sort of techno-utopianism, and now it's destroying democracy. So I guess my answer to your question is maybe to stop thinking about the internet. And I'm not saying we should make that story more complicated by saying, oh, there's many internet, there are internets, or there's infrastructure, and there's code, and there's platforms, and there's content. Why do I care about technology? I don't really care about technology. I care about inequality and power. And I was trying to think of a sort of catchy phrase. I think what we're seeing is that these technologies are basically used for a kind of stealth deregulation. And I've been thinking about how we should think about the future we want. I think that's really important. What would a socialist, you know, not social media, but democratic socialist media look like? But what we're heading towards is what I call the retro future. And I'm very interested in the way that technology is being used and invoked to justify getting rid of the limited protections and regulations that we had in many, many domains. And that's why those of us who are active in certain political spheres need to be aware of the internet and technology, and not just leave this discourse to people who are, you know, into computers. So you can see the way, to use Trevor's example, right? Traditional workplace protections, worker protections are being undermined. I do a lot of debtor organizing work around financial justice. You can see the way traditional consumer protections that came about in the 70s, they already were shit. They're being totally circumvented by consumer marketing scores that basically are, you know, credit scores on steroids and are totally unaccountable. You can see this in the way that advertising has gone haywire, right, and has very few restrictions on it. I remember being in San Francisco and this woman at a cafe, this young woman, she was just complaining at the fact that there was, you know, the slightest limitations on the digital advertising she could do to children, you know? And this is the sort of new, era. I think that the net neutrality news can be also read as an attack on New Deal policies, right? The FCC is a product of the New Deal. The FTC is a product of the progressive era. Again, consumer protections from the 70s, all these are being undone. So I think that looking at technology as a sort of stealth way to get around all of these hard-won, you know, imperfect steps, these imperfect bits of progress is really key to me.
Astra, you mentioned net neutrality. That's definitely something I want to come back to in a minute. But before we do, I kind of wanted to keep it in the broad mode. If each of you are kind of thinking about which battle to begin with, I kind of want to raise the question of who's going to fight that battle, raise the question of political constituency. Because I think it's safe to say that the internet politics conversation, to the extent that it exists, is dominated by kind of policy experts of a technocratic bent, where the emphasis is about finding the right policy and imposing it from above, rather than building a mass politics where demands are bubbling up from below. So when we think about building the internet we want, however we're interpreting that, how do we create a democratic movement to democratize the digital sphere? And how does that movement, or how might that movement fit into these broader currents that have emerged with the post-Occupy left? And I don't need everyone to, well, everyone should if they feel inclined, but we don't have to, I don't have to be the school teacher, and we don't have to go down the line anymore. So whoever feels compelled.
Well, I'll just say that I hear you, Astra. Like, I decided to write my book, Weapons of Math Destruction, when I was working at a startup in New York City in 2012. And I literally, I had been in finance, I had joined Occupy. My Occupy colleagues had explained to me the connections between financial corruption and sexism, racism, and power, and corruption in general, which I really didn't understand, being a naive mathematician. And then I was working within this new startup scene, and as a data scientist, I was supposed to think of myself as nothing like a quant in finance, but I was like, well, there's a lot of commonalities here beyond the techniques that we're using. And in particular, I see this action I'm doing, which is choosing winners and losers through algorithms, as increasing inequality. I'm choosing richer, whiter, more educated people with Macs to win every time. No one around me knew what I was talking about, and there was no resonance. So I was like, I need to write this book, and the idea was, everyone needs to know about this. Everyone needs to know that these algorithms are picking the winners and losers, and they're everywhere. They're choosing our credit cards, our insurance, whether we get a job, whether we get to college, how long we go to prison, whether we get arrested, all these things. And they affect all of us, but not equally. Having said that, and I'm very, very happy about the reception of my book, and people really care about this, and that's wonderful. But when they ask me, what can I do? I don't know what to say beyond if you're in a teacher union and your union is, and your colleagues are being scored by some ridiculous, statistically flawed algorithm, then talk to your union rep and hire me as an expert witness. But most of the time, we're not collective, right? We're like, everyone who's ever going to apply it to a job online is not a group that can organize. So I'm always looking for something, and I'm hoping to hear tonight about how I can answer that question in a better way. Because at the end of the day, algorithms, which I think of as the rules on not just the internet, but basically everywhere, because it's often offline, they're perfect mechanisms that are impossible for an individual to fight against. They are invisible rules that no one in particular is in charge of, and no one can answer to, and no one in particular needs to correct if they're wrong. And at the same time, they increase inequality and threaten democracy. So it's a real problem, and I'm hoping to I'm just echoing the fact that this is a real problem. I'm not really offering a solution, but I'm really hoping to hear more, because it's a really big fight. And it's not, and sometimes you hear oh, this isn't new. This is new. This is new. It's not new to have secret or opaque rules, but the massive scale at which we're now seeing these opaque rules play out is a new thing, and I don't know how to deal with it, and I'm hoping we can figure it out.
Anyone else?
Yeah. So it is new, but there's aspects of it that aren't new, like to go to credit reporting. It used to be total mayhem, right? This Wild West, and your credit report would have everything like, oh, he's the town drunkard, and he's a philanderer, and there's all this unnecessary information. And then they sort of reined it in, and now we have these lovely credit bureaus that are so responsible and unhackable. But at least they have some accountability, and there's some rules by which people can say, okay, there's actually misinformation. I know what information is being put on this. You get your credit report, and you're going to see your credit card bill and your student loan account, right? The techies who have built these algorithms that are, yes, opaque and yes, invisible, are also designed purposefully to sort of go around the Fair Credit Reporting Act, right? To not violate the laws as they exist. So what they do is they're putting back all of that irrelevant data, like who your friends are and what color shoes you like and all this stuff, and then you get a score which determines, what kind of financial product you're going to be offered. So I guess the thing is, it's unprecedented. These tools are wild, but then we've sort of been here before in a lot of these areas. And I think for me, the radical in me just says, God, it sucks that we have to fight these battles again to just get some basic consumer protections. I want the socialist revolution. But I think we have to just kind of set some very, kind of banal goals like that. Like, we need to apply some of these rules in this space. And talking about it, I think bringing some of it down to earth, this technology isn't totally all-powerful. It's doing some very, basic, greedy, asshole-ish things. Like, let's rein that in.
So there are actually small experiments in this sort of platform co-op scene that try to respond to some of these issues, Cathy, that you brought up. So in Switzerland is a health data cooperative called My Data, and so they basically create a cooperative data ownership over health data for patients that they can then selectively release to their doctors or hospitals. And they sort of dream of a federated cooperative cloud, essentially. And working on that, another example is in the blockchain area, basically Archain, which is a cooperative operating out of Berlin, they apply the cooperative principle of one worker, one vote on the algorithm. So basically people the cooperative communicates the features and the operation of the algorithm to the cooperative, and then they vote on it. These are very small but sort of nascent examples.
I'd like to guide the conversation back to net neutrality because it's such a big issue. Before I do, I realize I forgot to say something, which is that I think we will have index cards, is that correct? For writing down questions, if people have questions in the Q&A portion. Someone or some people may be distributing index cards. So if you'd like to ask a question or have me ask your question for you, write it down, and we will be collecting those a little bit later. Sorry for not mentioning that earlier. And yeah, and there's also, if people want to sit down, there's still more space on the ground. Okay, net neutrality, it's obviously something that we should discuss because 2 days ago, as many people probably know, they repealed the net neutrality protections from 2015, which just to kind of set the scene here, those rules prohibited ISPs like Comcast from doing certain things like blocking access to certain sites, slowing customer speeds, developing so-called fast lanes for paid prioritization of content. And those rules also had reclassified ISPs as common carriers, which made them subject to stricter forms of regulation for the first time. So obviously that was, a big moment. It was definitely all over the internet. I think it's safe to say that net neutrality has been maybe the most influential idea in digital governance so far. And my question is, how should the left relate to net neutrality as both a framework, a kind of way of thinking, and as a specific set of rules? What do you think are its strengths, and what do you think are its weaknesses?
Well, I think it's important to recognize that net neutrality is ultimately sort of a regulatory band-aid for a problem that runs downstream from a much deeper structural issue, which is that internet service providers operate as largely unchecked regional monopolies, right? They charge us whatever we're willing to pay for whatever kind of service we're willing to tolerate. And the fact that they would want to, these avenues for potential corporate collusion are just an extension of things that they really already do. And I think that the connection is that this net neutrality moment, this like widespread support that the idea has gotten, is really inspiring and surprising to me because it's just crazy that this many people are getting riled up over Title II of the Communications Act of 1934. It's like a very obscure regulation that really impacts society in a pretty opaque way, but it connects directly back to this question of ownership, right, of broadband networks. And I think that it's very important to seize on that question and emphasize that ultimately this was a regulation that was intended to prevent antisocial behavior from monopolists, and it has sort of proven the limits of trying to regulate the monopolies in this way, right? I mean, they've been historically very resistant to these kinds of things. And so I think one of the best ways to try to capture this energy is into local campaigns for public broadband networks, right? So this can be as simple as trying to get a city councilor to pass a resolution to investigate the feasibility of a municipal broadband scheme in a town, right? It can be lobbying state legislators to look into repealing the laws that limit and prohibit the construction of public broadband networks in a lot of the states in the country. So I think that the best thing that can be done with this energy is to channel it into local schemes to try to challenge the power of the ISPs on a local level and bring the networks that people depend on under control of public bodies that can be held accountable through democratic processes, right? I mean, I think one of the things I worry about with the Net Neutrality Coalition is it's very unstable. I think that a lot of it was built on these sort of half-true or kind of incorrect explanations of what it was. Like, it's free speech for the internet. That's kind of true, not exactly. And so I think that in this moment, rather than just letting that energy dissipate, we need to really aggressively hammer it down into this more fundamental issue of who owns the cables that connect us all to the internet.
Good responses from that one. Any other feelings about net neutrality?
I think he has feelings.
Trebor,
Feelings.
do you have feelings you want to share with us? I have other questions.
I have some feelings.
Yeah, tell us your feelings.
So I totally agree. I think the thing to do in this moment is to push for something that's a bit more visionary than just net neutrality as it's been presented. But, actually it's giving me a lot of bad Obama feelings. And I think I think in this moment we actually have to kind of know our regulatory history a bit, because this is something that's I'm involved in a fight with the Department of Education right now, and this is happening, something very similar is happening in this space where these rules that we fought so hard for under the Obama administration are being reversed. And the kind of framework the gloss that's being put on is like, these evil Republicans are undoing everything good the liberals fought for and did. And so there's truth to that, right, in the sense that Title II, it was classified as Title II. But a big question is why did that happen in 2015 and not in 2010? Why was the first, chairperson, basically someone who came straight from the, telecom lobbying? There's so much time wasted under the Obama administration. If they had Title II in place earlier, then the ISP privacy rules wouldn't be able to repeal, Congress wouldn't have been able to repeal those as effortlessly as they did. And I don't know if people remember, but there was this whole hiccup, right, in 2010, where what happened actually is that Verizon and Google got together and made this kind of wishy-washy proposal that was like, yeah, let's have net neutrality for wired broadband, but not for wireless, when the future is mobile, right? The future is not wired. And then the court struck that down. So there was all of this middling, hemming, and hawing that got us into this situation. So I just think there's also all this latent authority the FCC did not use when it had Title II on the table. And we have to know that so that we can hold them accountable. This whole idea of we want democratic accountability, right? Like they could cap broadband prices. They didn't. They could have done, again, the privacy stuff earlier and had it actually stick. So I think we just need to be angry at this administration and scoff at that stupid video of the guy dancing, but also be like, there's a whole lot that the supposedly good team did not do right. The FTC, chair that Obama appointed wrote a Wall Street Journal op-ed that was like, oh, it's not such a big deal about net neutrality. And ignored his own staff who wanted to punish Google for elevating its own, offerings in search, right? So there's so much to be angry about, and I think we need a sort of deeper analysis.
I want to kind of recenter the question of ownership, because that's something that's come up a few times, and Evan just raised it recently in response to net neutrality. It seems like in building the internet we want, alternatives to private ownership seem like a pretty critical piece of that. You mentioned public ownership, Evan. Trebor, we've been talking about cooperative forms of ownership. And I want to explore that a little bit. I want to talk about what specific problems they solve. And I also kind of want to press on the difficulties and some of the challenges and criticisms that they might trigger. So for one, Evan, you've talked about and written about like very successful experiments with public ownership of internet infrastructure in Chattanooga. It's great to have an experiment to point to. I'd say one thing I've heard from a lot of folks when you raise the possibility of public ownership is, the specter of state surveillance, right? And specifically now that there is such a reactionary federal government, I think when you tell folks, well, do you want Trump owning the internet? Like for a lot of people, that's like a very effective scare tactic, right, with this type of model. Trebor, with cooperative ownership, I feel like one thing I hear sometimes also is, the experiments are very exciting, but how do we scale it, right? How do we actually make this something that can pose a threat to the corporate internet? So, and obviously it doesn't have to be limited to the two of you, but I'd love to talk about, again, the problems that these forms of ownership solve, but then the other challenges that they may face.
I can go first if you want. So yeah, it's inevitable that people would worry about governments abusing power over the cables that provide our internet access in the way that private companies currently do, whether it's through surveillance or censorship. Like one could imagine a government blocking or throttling certain kinds of content, as net neutrality was intended to protect against. I think the thing to really emphasize here is what I'm talking about, what's sort of on the immediate horizon for building out public broadband networks. These are things happening on a very local scale where it's much easier to hold bodies accountable. And in the long term, one would hope that the First Amendment is a stronger protection than Title II of the Communications Act of 1934 in terms of like censorship and throttling speech on the internet. And as for surveillance, my thought is the government doesn't need to own the last mile infrastructure to be able to conduct mass surveillance. This is already happening, and I don't think that the question of last mile broadband infrastructure being controlled by a municipal government is necessarily that important in that.
So I think it's very difficult to change what you don't own, right? And so this applies to platforms. So what we've seen with worker cooperatives, they have definitely had a huge challenge in the United States in terms of scaling. So they're, I think, a bit over 400. So there's a very small number. So I think, but the format of the digital platform, especially the labor platform, is just perfectly suited to scale, right? So, and I think, like 1 in 3 Americans is part of a cooperative, like this kind of, they're not all equally important, right? So, you're probably part of housing co-ops, and what does that mean, right? Is that very political? Probably not, right? But there are various forms, right? Like from multi-stakeholder to worker co-ops, so this is a longer discussion. But I think that ownership really matters, and that you can definitely scale through replication of small projects, right? So this idea that you have to replicate Silicon Valley, that you have to create the cooperative Uber, is just ridiculous, right? So because you can very well create a cooperative that functions in New York City as an up-and-go.coop, right? This sort of cleaning co-op that functions as a platform co-op here in New York, that employs low-income immigrant women, and they don't have to conquer the world, right? There's no need for them to conquer the world. They do just fine with their cooperatives here in New York City, but you can take that model and bring it to San Francisco, and you can bring it to Ohio, right? And you can bring it to Montana. So you can replicate.
But isn't that one of the ironies, is that co-ops actually have to live by the market, right, and be able to sort of sustain themselves with revenue, whereas a lot of these tech companies have so much VC capital that they don't have to be profitable, they just get millions from Norway's sovereign wealth fund or whatever.
Yeah, but that's sugar money, right? That's sugar money
Right.
that will evaporate. So it's, when you think about your Uber rides that are subsidized, right? So this is a short-term benefit for the consumer, but long-term harm to the whole economy, right? Because you have basically the competition being destroyed. And in the long run, right, this doesn't help consumers at all.
Yeah.
Go for it,
I
please.
just wanted to, I'm curious what you had to say about this, because I think that there are very real benefits to consolidated networks. I mean, I think that one of the cool things about interfacing with other people in different corners of the world through platforms that are integrated with huge data structures is that we can create things by engaging with each other and engaging with the world. And it's a question of, it's a very serious question, of course, how that data that's being generated is used and to what ends. But, a small local platform version of Uber might be able to displace them from a local market and work well there, but they're not going to be able to, harvest enough data to help with building a self-driving car, for instance.
Right, but so it's complex, right? So there are many different models. So I completely agree with you. And with some forms, of course, that is necessary. You can't have like Airbnb is trying to challenge the Airbnb model. So basically trying to create a resident-driven short-term rental market. But of course, that's very hard, right? If somebody only goes to Brussels, they also want to go to Ghent, and then they want to go to Paris, and then they want to go to Rome. So it's like, and if they aren't really operating and interconnecting, but they're trying that. So in some areas, you have to do that, but in others, you don't. And I just reject this idea that there is only this one model, and everything has to scale to world domination. I think that's just not right. It's not true either. So you can replicate the model. You don't always have to have. So you are right. True. So.
That's great. Everybody agrees. Hopefully we'll get to some disagreement soon. I think when we're talking about platforms, we have to talk about algorithms. And this is something that I really struggle with, the question of algorithmic governance. How can we start to build more democratic structures around algorithms? I know algorithmic transparency has become like a big issue recently. I know that NYC DSA Tech Action has been involved in a local municipal effort to bring more algorithmic transparency to the algorithms that the city government uses to make decisions about where kids go to school, for instance. The thing I struggle with around algorithmic transparency is how do you begin to explain something as complicated as an algorithm? And then how do you, beyond that, enable popular participation in how those rules are written, right? Because it seems like as we're building the internet we want, one of the things that we might want as part of that internet is the ability for people whose lives are affected by these algorithms to participate in their design. But again, how would one even begin to approach that? I mean, Trebor, when we talk about cooperative platforms, and I know you resist the idea that we have to replicate the model of Silicon Valley, but when we think about Facebook, I mean, how could we make something like the newsfeed algorithm, right, the subject of democratic deliberation? So I apologize for the question because it's not very well formed, but algorithms and how we approach them and how we democratize them is something I'm struggling with. If anyone has input.
I'll jump in. So I think, I'm not surprised that the Facebook algorithm, the newsfeed algorithm is so on people's minds because election and all that stuff. But it is like the hardest. And so it's like, I wish we could start with something much simpler along the lines of the predictive policing or recidivism risk or filtering for job applications. None of them are simple, but they are a heck of a lot simpler than the Facebook feed, which is, in its own way, very simple, but I think its effects are very complicated and nuanced. So I think, and I don't think, I'll add that I'm a data scientist myself, having spoken to many data scientists who build these algorithms, they don't think in terms of democracy whatsoever. They don't even think in terms of power. They think in terms of objective functions for the most part. Which is to say they've been told to optimize to accuracy or something along those lines. They often don't even think in terms of how to balance false positives with false negatives. which in the case of, say, a recidivism risk algorithm, which judges use to sentence defendants, is the difference between sending someone to jail for a crime they won't do versus sending someone to jail longer for a crime they won't do versus sending them to jail for a shorter amount of time, even in spite of the fact they will do another crime. I mean, it's a crazy mixed up system. But the point is that very, very, very important ethical and justice and civil rights considerations are not being even considered by the people building these algorithms. So while I will say that I don't think transparency per se is a very meaningful concept in this realm, because speaking as a data scientist, I could make something that's technically transparent but totally meaningless pretty easy. I mean, that's what we're good at when we're data scientists, is making things that seem explanatory, not be at all explanatory. I do think there is a route to building algorithms that are actually meaningfully transparent. And I was just in a conversation this last week at Data and Society, which I'm sure many of you have heard of, where people were presenting this upcoming set of European laws called the GDPR. And there's this conversation around what it means to have a right to explanation. So that in Europe, starting in a couple years, for automated decisions, which are basically, that's code for algorithms, and it's not clear which algorithms, but I think it's pretty clear that a crime risk algorithm would qualify. You have the right to explanation. And again, well, what does that mean? It could be really stupid. Their argument was that it has to expose the question of whether your rights are being violated. The explanation has to give you enough information so that if your civil rights are being violated or any other kind of rights, you can say, hey, that's not fair. So it gives you sort of enough ammunition to hire a lawyer, which isn't perfect because maybe you don't have the money for a lawyer, you don't have time to understand the explanation, et cetera, but it is a very, very strong step. And again, it's not, let's not wait for the data scientists involved to sort of start caring, because they're not going to. They're being paid usually by big, fancy tech firms to do this stuff and not think very hard about it. Let's start thinking in terms of if we have the information, which we don't have right now. These algorithms, for the most part, are being made by black box algorithms that we have no view into. But if we are given that view with meaningful explanation, then it'll give us ammunition, especially if we learn how to share it on a platform, to say, hey, I was fucked by this algorithm in this way. Were you also fucked in that way? Yes. Okay, let's file a class action lawsuit, whatever that looks like. And I think, it's a path forward. It's only happening in Europe, but I do think that could be a real, depending on how it works out, it could be pretty cool.
I do think this is a sort of an academic's answer and an abstract answer, but I do think very broadly that sort of politicizing the algorithms themselves and challenging this language of neutrality and optimization that has surrounded them for so long, this idea that optimizing for a metric like engagement, say, is a neutral kind of decision, is very important. And I do think, as much as many data scientists or folks who work for big tech companies may be being paid to not ask precisely these questions, that there is, as evidenced by all of y'all being here in this room, there is this moment of opportunity where I think a lot of folks who work in the industry have had a sort of WTF moment following the election, sort of following, as I was talking about earlier, the split between tech leadership and tech workers that's become visible on a variety of issues. So I do think politicizing, creating a language to talk about how values like, say, engagement are not necessarily neutral, I think is a very valuable kind of intellectual and political work to be doing in this precise moment.
And maybe one concrete way of changing that too is
for the concretion.
Is to think about design processes too, right? So in this sort of platform co-op community, there is real emphasis on co-design, right? So to think about designing these platforms from the very first day with the people who will populate them, right? So that basically all along the design process, you also account for outliers, right? You account for difference that are usually not reflected in big data or in these platforms. So leading to a more worker-centric design. Well, yeah, all stakeholders, but also workers. Yeah.
I mean, I think it's very important we talk about algorithms and that people who have expertise fight for access to what's inside the black box. But now I'm sort of putting on my political organizer hat, and as I mentioned, I do a lot of work with a group called the Debt Collective. We're building a 21st century debtors union, and we're building an online platform. With members who have been defrauded, who have been victims of predatory lending, who are economically screwed, and to me, it's just, when you're talking to people, you don't necessarily go, the algorithm is mysterious. You go, the outcome of a process. You talk about the outcome. So I wrote a piece for The Nation quite a while ago that I basically had two Facebook identities, sort of one that I just used for my organizing work, and because of who I was associated with, the ads I saw radically changed, and I started getting, financial scams, ads for for-profit schools, and all of this stuff, right? Which suddenly gave me much more empathy and insight into the fact that all of these people that I knew at the time were falling for these scams, right? Like, call this number and you'll get your loans canceled, and actually they would just get their bank account info and start debiting, $200 a month from a poor person's bank account, or charge them $1,000 for doing something that you can do for free on a government website, right? So seeing these very concrete effects, and yeah, I don't know, but I wouldn't lead with the algorithm. Right? I would lead with the outcome and with the injustice. And I think we have to sort of square that circle when we think about building a sort of mass movement around these issues. And there's some experts who talk about the fact that, some of the biggest ad buyers before the 2008 economic collapse were, basically mortgage lenders and financial service providers, right? And that lead generators online played a huge role in getting subprime mortgages out there into the market. So you can also make really big social, economic arguments that this stuff, it goes so beyond the individual and what we see and what we're targeted with, and to the fact that it helped bring down, the economy. So outcomes and then algorithms.
I'm going to push back on that because, in your example with the Debt Collective, which I love, by the way, is definitely agree with you.
Yeah.
But let me just give you another industry, which is just an enormous fucking industry, which is job applications. Unfortunately, there is no visible outcome to the failures of filters that deny people jobs who are qualified, because they just never get the job. That's not a tragedy from their perspective, except it's a lost opportunity, but they don't know that that they were qualified. I just talked this week, this is actually a really exciting moment for me, because in my book, I profiled Kyle Beam, who was denied a job at Kroger's grocery store in Atlanta, Georgia. He recognized the questions in the personality test with the algorithm that he had to this test he had to take online. He recognized some of the questions as being familiar, and they were questions from the 5-factor model, which was a mental health assessment that he had at a mental health hospital when he had been treated for bipolar disorder. It just happened that he recognized some questions. That, in other words, let me just spell it out. There was a mental health assessment embedded in a personality test for a job. And this wasn't just at Kroger's. There were actually 7 different enormous companies using exactly the same test that were illegally, because it's against the law under the ADA, Americans with Disability Act, means that it's illegal to force anyone to take a health exam, including a mental health exam, just filtering out people illegally from employment systematically. And it was very unlikely, but lucky that Kyle figured this out, and that his father, who's a lawyer, filed class action lawsuits against all 7 companies. So just this week, Lowe's, which is one of the companies, has put out a press release saying that they are going to change their online application because they want to, abide by the law, basically. But I'm just making the point that it's really good news, and thank God for Kyle's father for doing this, quitting his job, by the way, basically as an M&A lawyer, and just becoming a full-time activist. But I'm just saying, that's not a visible, really, it was invisible to almost everyone. but it is an algorithmic harm.
Can
Yeah,
if I could just say
please,
one really
absolutely.
quick thing about workers again. I do think that perhaps there's like a middle ground between these two positions where it's like, of course, we need to think about outcomes and we need to think about algorithms, and in a way, demystifying tech work has an important role to play in that process. You know, starting, of course, there are really important forms of expertise, and there's important work for folks who have that expertise, that kind of technical expertise to do in clarifying these algorithmic processes. But at the same time, I think the sort of technocratic impulse that says that work is best left to this small circle of experts is something that we need to push back against, and that indeed folks are pushing back against by doing kind of more sort of outward-facing organizing. So anyway, I just wanted to chime in with that.
Yeah, no, thank you for that, because that provides a perfect segue to what may be the last question. We have about 10 minutes left in this conversation, then we'll have question and answer. We've got some index cards with some questions. I want to talk about workers. Workers have come up a little bit, but I think if we're thinking about how the left should relate to the internet and build the internet we want, we should talk about labor. I think one of the things that is often missed in the popular discussion is that the internet is built by workers. It's built by the tech workers who write the code, who maintain the systems. It's built by the communications workers who maintain the physical infrastructure of the internet, the culture workers who keep us clicking and streaming, and many other categories of workers. Astra, I know you've written a lot on the impact of the internet on culture industry, culture workers, and Moira, you've written about these recent efforts in tech worker organizing in the Bay Area, and others, you know, workers have come up in our responses already. So I'd love to hear about what is the role of workers in building the internet we want? How should the left think about the different kinds of labor that keep the internet running? And how could we potentially use workers' control over the digital means of production to advance some kind of agenda for digital democracy? Who wants to jump in first? Moira?
No, actually, he asked you. I think I already said a lot of what I have to say. You don't want to? Trevor has something to say.
Well, so if you, well, I guess sort of you could try to sort of start looking at this, sort of looking back to the past 40 years, right, and the increase in economic inequality, and sort of take 2008 as a marker, and at the heels of the financial crisis, the emergence of these platform companies, right? So you had 2005 Amazon Mechanical Turk, right, which is a crowdsourcing platform that employs, nobody really knows exactly how many people, and there are many companies like it. So there's a real shift of labor markets to the internet, like I said before. And the sharing economy used this moment, right, the financial crisis, to basically shift, to create sort of a shift away from direct employment to move all these constraints, right, and basically create and amplify a mode of working that is devoid of worker rights, that gives unions no chance to meaningfully support, at least traditional sort of unions, to support workers. And so that's, I think, a really important component to this, all this invisible digital labor, right? Invisible digital labor that powers, with human beings embedded in the algorithms, powering companies like Amazon and the economy more broadly.
Yeah, I mean, the writing I did on culture workers and the People's Platform was partly a response to the way the internet conversation was taking place at that moment. So back in the old days of 2009, right, the big bad guys who the internet was going to overthrow were the record labels. And this was like, it just seemed like every article about the internet ultimately was about record labels. And, you know, so the revolution was going to, and I was just like, okay, so the revolution is going to be getting rid of the RIA, but then, you know, empowering Spotify. I was just like, we can do better. And embedded in that conversation was this celebration of amateurism, right? So it was also that journalism was going to collapse, but it's great because we can all blog or Facebook, and we can all be musicians in our bedrooms. And it was just, I thought, just a very cynical elevation of amateurism as a cover for building these huge extractive companies. And it led me to sort of think about the artist as sort of the archetype, right? Under neoliberalism, the artist is the person who loves working so much. They're basically their own intern, and it's so great, and we should all be like that and work for free and not demand benefits. And, there were articles at the time, they're like, being a grad student is kind of like being an artist. And and then somebody was fired from Apple and told that working at Apple is like being an artist. And it was just this ideological, piece. So I was like, okay, artists, how about if we start thinking of ourselves as workers? And there are all of these ways that we don't, right? So if you're a musician, you do a gig, right? Or there are all these sort of things that sort of abstract us and not think of ourselves as workers. I mean, at the end of the day, organizing artists is just not where I want to put my energy, because I think it's really limited returns, and there's something deep in the psychology of most creative people that they're not that politically strategic, and they don't really have that much leverage. So maybe in another life I would have been a more straight up labor organizer, but instead I'm working on debtor organizing, partly on the principle that debt is wage theft, right? And that this is a form of organizing that can be very complementary to all sorts of other economic justice efforts. And so I think there's just a lot of potential there. So I wish the cultural workers would rise up and have an analysis, but I think right now they're basically just being used as a figure so that other people will get the sort of negative parts of being an artist, which is the precarity, right? The economic insecurity, not knowing where your paycheck is coming from, instead of the good parts of it, right? Which is a sort of autonomy, dignity of labor, freedom over your time. So I wish more people would have the good parts of being an artist and not the negative parts.
Yeah, I think there's something interesting about trying to reclaim a kind of like moral language around labor or something, or like I think there is something about worker as like a category, which I love to almost hold in tension to this like cynical use of amateurism, right? Where it's like calling work love has been a really great strategy to get everyone to work for free, like forever. And there's something so interesting about that decentralizing sort of pseudo-democratic language, because on the one hand, it is kind of true. Like it is true that Facebook has made it possible for like everyone to be a broadcaster and, is destroying the traditional media. And then at the same time, it's true that democratic decentralization has produced like the greatest concentration of private power and wealth in the history of the world. So there's sort of like two like foci of an ellipse or something. But I think that kind of, sort of again denaturalizing this like language around love and doing what you love and like reclaiming worker or like value creator as a kind of meaningful category seems like a really important political move right now that applies across a wide variety of people who work on or with the internet, which as I think about it and I feel like has implicitly emerged from our conversation, includes like literally everyone. It's like no one isn't working on the internet in some way at this point. So the internet we want is kind of just like the world. It's coextensive with the world we want in a certain sense. So anyway, that's my 2 cents.
I think that's a great segue, that the internet we want is the world we want, to our questions. We've got, I think, maybe about 5, and we'll hopefully get to as many as we can. Hopefully this is the first of many conversations, so we may not be able to be comprehensive. First question: people are motivated by bread and butter, material issues and concerns. So how can we connect the internet we want to existing struggles for jobs, healthcare, et cetera? Any reflections on that?
I mean, that's a very easy, this platform cooperatives are an answer to that, right? I mean, cooperatives have always been about precarity. They have always been driven and come out of, a group of hungry textile workers, right? Basically getting together, forming a cooperative to today's cooperatives that basically use this form of social organization, right, to link that to the digital economy. So it's a very bread and butter issue.
Yeah, I also think that there's a really clear connection to be made between organizing for public broadband and concepts like Medicare for all, which is this idea that's this thing that we've come to think of as a basic right and is just this necessary part of so many people's lives that private corporations are not able to provide in the way that they need to be. And in places where municipal broadband projects have been taken on at a larger scale, in many of those places, they find bipartisan support, right? And this is another way in which I think that it could be really useful to tack this onto the net neutrality moment, because that is also a thoroughly bipartisan issue in terms of who supports it. And I think that if that energy could be translated into something that could help build out real infrastructure, that could be a very productive use of it. And when people see it in their immediate lives and see the benefits of it, it's usually seen as an issue of common sense rather than a partisan issue.
Got an interesting question here, which returns to the question of work and asks us to address more exploitative forms of tech work, from YouTube editing, like content moderation, I imagine that's what that's getting to click labor. I think, Trebor, you hit on Mechanical Turk, but I'm wondering if we can talk a little bit more about these more forms of exploitative tech work, particularly in the Global South. Do you have any reflections on that, Trebor?
Yeah, so I mean, I have been working on digital labor since 2009, and the discussions started with Amazon Mechanical Turk, where novice workers to this day make $2 to $3 an hour, $2 to $3 an hour, and that's, you know, others. You can continue looking at platforms like Fiverr, or you know, where people make around $5 an hour. To others, which should actually be illegal, right? But then there's a sort of legal gray zone of the internet, so you have, it's not really enforced, right? Like labor law isn't really enforced. I mean, it's barely enforced in real life, right? Not to talk of the internet. And there's a plethora of formats of digital labor that, you know, where people work in endlessly different forms, which I sort of detailed in my book, right? Like that basically are coming out to the same tune of these quite extreme exploitation. The sharing economy. Oh, sorry.
No.
Yeah.
I was going to say also, I just think this is a huge issue in the Global South, and I know less about that area, but it's also really important to remember the workers who are extremely exploited in Silicon Valley, who are not Google or Facebook engineers, but are instead, I believe the ratio is 3 to 1. For sort of like every coding job, there are 3 people who maintain the building, or like work in the cafeteria, work as shuttle drivers, work as security. And so I think that it's like these patterns of intense exploitation are being created right in California. You know, one doesn't have to go to the Philippines sort of content moderation, exploitation hell to get it. And so that absolutely has to be part of broadening the conversation around tech work in the US as well.
Yeah, I mean, 2 quick thoughts. I mean, one, this is, yeah, it's the example of the regression, right, of these new forms of work that circumvent even minimum wage, these basic sort of floors that are falling out from under us. But I think making that work visible is really great. Journalists who have done it, like Adrian Chen, who have written a lot about these workers. I think maybe somewhere, it's over there. I don't know. I mean, I was thinking about it recently about, you know, to me, it's also like taking Silicon Valley and the techies and popping the bubble of it and bringing it down to earth. Like, it's not all automated and magic. There are all of these people doing what's basically slave labor. And it's not all, you know, and there are this huge labor force that they basically hide, in part because there's an ideological function, right? It just makes them look more technologically powerful and innovative and magic. It's like, no, your platform's not that great. There's actually just people constantly cleaning it up, you know? And there's a kind of fake automation that is being sold to us, you know, and it maybe one day it will all manifest and be real, and the robots will be doing everything, and we'll be writing poetry or watching cat videos or whatever we want to do. But right now, they just, you know, right now what it does more than anything is just make us believe that we're worthless. And so I think this connects back to the work thing is, you know, it's like, no, you know, human beings are still doing the vast majority of this work, and sort of not drinking the Kool-Aid.
I have a question that I want everyone to weigh in on, which is, should leftists be buying cryptocurrency? No. So we got a no from the audience. We got some yeses. So
If you have a time machine,
okay.
then do it.
No thoughts on whether we should buy it?
No. I love that this free market fantasy experiment has just turned into a giant pyramid scheme, essentially. I think it's pretty good demonstration of the vapidity of the entire project, in my opinion.
Well, that's pretty final. I think we got it. All right, I'm going to use that to pivot to another question, which hopefully has a more hopeful thought. we got to move it along here. This question is about, we touched on this a little bit, but how can we use existing technologies, right, like blockchain, peer-to-peer, machine learning? How do we use those existing technologies to begin to build alternatives? Trebor, I think you spoke to this, but I'm wondering if we can kind of revisit that, because I think the scale of the problem are so big. The system imagining the internet, and is it even useful to think of the internet as a single thing? It's kind of hard. It's easy to get lost in this question. So how do we use existing technologies to begin to build those alternatives?
Also, when you rip out the algorithmic heart of Uber, you can't just sort of put it into a platform core, right? So what you see is actually that you can't just create. It's not about creating replicas, right? It's about embedding distinctly different values in that code of these alternatives, right? And you see that very clearly with some of the examples I mentioned already. I should also just drop into the conversation this cooperative music streaming site, Resonate, because we talked about Spotify. So, but you see, for example, with Up and Go, the cooperative decided against an individual worker profile, right? Because they said, so people are pitted against each other, right, in the sort of extractive sharing economy, and we don't want to do this, right? So we have this pride in our work as a co-op, right? So we don't need that. So what you see is you never know who is coming. You just see basically the cooperative. You see a photo of the group, and you know one of them will come to you, but you don't know who it will be. And there's no individual identity, basically, worker identity. So they are actually quite different in their design, right? So it's not just about creating copies.
I think also we can make tools that are really, really simple and that can do a lot. And I'm thinking about an example from the Debt Collective where we built a mobile-friendly app that basically was an application, like literally you filled out this information that would allow you to submit a debt dispute to the Department of Education based on an obscure right that basically the Department of Education had never figured out how one might utilize this right. So we worked with lawyers. We created this very easy to understand, simple app you could use on your cell phone. The federal government went from getting maybe 8 of these over the span of decades to getting tens of thousands of them, because precisely to Evan's point, even if there had been a form on the government website, people would have had to go to the local library and print it out and take a day off work and go mail it. So just by doing something as simple as basically like a PDF you fill out on your phone is all what it took to sort of make a game-changing difference and win hundreds of millions of dollars of debt relief for people. So yeah, we don't have to make things that are fancy.
I would say that, there's nothing inherently oppressive about algorithms or any of these tools. It's about design, it's about intent. Many of the algorithms I talk about as weapons of mass destruction in my book could be used for good. I feel like, my favorite example along those lines is recidivism risk algorithms, crime risk, like what is the likelihood of someone returning to prison? Instead of using it to shift the blame for society's problems onto the individual, we could be using it as a mirror to see what's wrong with us, that we have such higher recidivism risk for certain populations, and how do we intervene to improve that disparity. So I don't think it's inherently evil, but I do think that we have this rhetoric that is controlled by Silicon Valley and the media that does whatever they want, that makes it seem like there's an inevitability to all technology. That's why we always hear about when the cars are all self-driving, or when the robots all take our jobs, as if that's a technological inevitability instead of a political choice, which we actually know it is. And along the same lines, last pet peeve, when people talk about AI taking over and becoming conscious and whatever, that's absolute complete bullshit. But it's useful because what it does is it separates who's responsible for these choices, the way that technology is used. Like the idea is we're separating ourselves, even though we're the ones embedding these technologies with these values, we're separating ourselves from those values and saying it's the algorithms that have those values. And by the way, they might decide we're expendable. But the truth is, like, we should know that we're the ones building these things, and we could be building them to make a better world instead of making a more oppressive world.
So in our last few minutes, I wanted to conclude on a conclusive feeling question, which we have, which is that if we're going to all go out into the world, all the people in this room, and build digital democracy, as I'm sure we will, how do we rally around one message? What would that one message be? Evan, you talked about Medicare for all and maybe drawing an analogy between internet access and Medicare for all. How do we kind of revisit this question of political constituency? What's the big message that we want to go out into the world in our last few minutes? It's impossible.
I mean, it's something that would unify all of the concepts that we've been talking about,
Or something that's politically useful right now. I mean, I think part of the thing that we've been struggling with throughout, and which has been really useful because it's hopefully the beginning of many conversations, is the authentic difficulty of some of these issues. I mean, healthcare connects to people's lives. I can knock on someone's door in Reno, Nevada, and say your premiums will go down. Maybe we could do that with public ISPs, and maybe that's where we should start. But a lot of these issues, the complexity is a real barrier to building mass politics around them. So maybe I've answered my own question.
Mic drop.
Yeah, well, I mean, with respect to building out public broadband projects, that seems like conceptually the easiest thing to wrap my head around on the panel, because talking about democratic control of algorithms, that's a lot more abstract than ownership of real physical infrastructure that directly impacts what kind of quality of internet service people are going to be getting. So I think that in terms of like immediately reaching people, like, talking to them about like what internet costs in other parts of the world, other parts of the country, how their lives might be different if they had a more reliable access to the internet. I mean, these kinds of initiatives exist in the country. If there was going to be, I don't know, I can't think of like a really good singular rallying cry that I feel super strong about, but I feel like talking about public ownership of last mile infrastructure is sort of like the most tangible part of the internet. It's the thing that directly connects with people's homes and touches their lives in the most visible way. So I think that that's a really strong place to start because that helps you cross the conceptual barrier of thinking about the internet itself as a collective good.
Yeah. I mean, I totally agree. I think if, a public option for healthcare polls really well. Like, what a public option for internet? And you just leave it that vague. I mean, we know that different countries have different models, some that use more private insurance companies and some that are single payer, and leave it vague. But I feel in this moment, tying into what you said, which is it's not luxury, which is kind of how they want to, portray it, right? It's just the place you Instagram or whatever. So, and you can still do that, don't worry. But to say, no, it's actually essential for education, for jobs, for all of these things. And
a lot of even sort of centrist politicians take this line. Like in New York City, we gave Verizon an exclusive contract if they agreed to connect Fios to every home and business in the city. That was in 2008, 9 years later, and the city is suing them because they've failed to do that to almost a third of the homes. So politicians already talk about the internet this way. They just don't execute strategies that actually help get us there.
I think it's about everything, right? So I see all these, I guess, the social crisis, right? So, and I think everything that gets us out of that is fantastic, right? So there's policy work, right? There's the infrastructure work, there's the work on labor, and there's the work on sort of creating, alternatives, right? However small they may be or however scalable they may be. And I think all of that matters, right? So like working on regulation and working on these experiments and all of you being here and going home and hopefully, thinking about a different model of functioning in the world, sort of drifting away from this sort of homo economicus to a more, peer-to-peer sort of way of thinking about the world, a more commons-oriented way.
I mean, I'll just say, like, I would draw an analogy to the tax bill that the GOP just came up with. Like, nobody's happy with that process. It was secret, and it benefits donors and people who are writing it, and it's abstract, it's a set of rules. It's a very complicated set of rules, so it's abstract, but it also is very, very real, and it's going to affect people. And I feel like that's a pretty good analogy to black box algorithms. Like, we have a bunch of people who are secretly writing rules that are going to really affect us. And it's not democratic and it's not fair.
Moira, would you like to have the last word?
Oh, no.
It's a lot of
I was just
pressure.
I think I love everything everyone said. I think we actually have this moment of political opportunity to talk about internet access and the internet as a kind of social right, like Astra's saying, like Evan's saying. Like, it's not like something you just use to go on Instagram. I mean, it's how we get access to everything we need, and perhaps this sort of crisis around net neutrality and the attention that's been mobilized around it, and the sort of left moment that we're all inhabiting, where Medicare for All is so popular, where these ideas of universal social programs are like trending, creates a chance actually to talk about internet access as something to which every human should be entitled rather than a luxury. So I think we need to claim it ambitiously as like a universal social good. So yeah, internet for all, I guess.
Internet for all. That's an excellent place to end. Thank you so much for doing this. This was so much fun.